Why does Iceland, one of the coldest countries on Earth, hold one of the only banana plantations in Europe? The answer has a lot to do with why Iceland has become so rich despite its hostile environment. Two things define Iceland's economic history: its location and its tiny population. Iceland sits alongside Greenland in the northern Atlantic, with its capital Reykjavik north of Anchorage, Iqaluit, and Nuuk. Food has a hard time growing in this cold of a climate, and, as I'm sure you know, humans can't live without food. So Iceland's population has always remained quite small as a result, fluctuating around 50,000 people for much of its history as it battled with famines and plagues. The country was poorly endowed, not even having many trees, and for over 200 years it was forced to sell its products only to the Kingdom of Denmark, which it was a colonial possession of. This can make it pretty surprising when you hear that by income per capita, Iceland is one of the 10 richest countries on Earth, and by average salary, it's in the top 3. Icelanders enjoy some of the highest quality lives out of anyone on Earth, despite the fact that even 50 years ago, they produced only a tenth of what they do today. The secret has been by smart supply-side economics on the part of their government, particularly of their energy and electricity resources. Per person, Iceland uses the second most amount of energy on Earth, only behind gas and slave-rich Qatar. But stripping out transportation and heating and only looking at electricity use, Icelanders have the most amount of electricity out of anywhere on Earth. It's not even close. Norway is a distant second. They generate 52 megawatt hours of electricity per person. Americans have less than a quarter of that. In total, that means they produce 20 terawatt hours, around the same level as Syria or Massachusetts. The island has no coal, gas, or nuclear infrastructure as well, with much of the energy coming from geothermal sources and most of the electricity from hydropower. It's a little, what you say, abundant, and it's allowed this small and cold country of less than 400,000 people to punch highly above their weight in terms of energy research, growing tropical fruits, and being the smallest country ever to make the World Cup. But it wasn't always this way. Iceland used to be a poor hinterland of Denmark. Back when agriculture dominated our ways of life, Iceland had some obvious problems. Most people on the island were self-sufficient farmers, but because of the tiny population and lack of resources, many moved throughout the year between the coasts in the winter to fish and pastures in the summer to tend sheep or cattle. This meant urban specialization never really happened, with only a couple of towns popping up. The trade monopoly with Denmark didn't help either. All the export products, mainly wool and fish, were directed to Copenhagen, with trading profits split between the king and Danish merchants. Most positions of power came from royal appointments or involvement with the church, and the vast majority of peasants were tenants tied to the land. Most of Iceland's history was one of vast inequality marked by stagnation and isolation. Despite the fact that this monopoly ended in 1855, like the rest of Europe, it wasn't until the 1870s where structural transformation took place, as Icelanders got legislative power for themselves. Unlike most countries though, which have a manufacturing phase between agriculture and services, Iceland's factories never became the dominant force in their economy. Instead, industrialization started in the fisheries with the adoption of steam trawlers and fish processing plants. The country, so small, has always depended on trade. However, that trade has depended on the technology available to do so. For example, in medieval Iceland, there was little point in shipping cheap, bulky items because it was far too expensive. Most of their imports were small, luxury goods like silver, wine, and whetstones. The exports have usually been derived from their natural resources. Up to 90% of the country's foreign exchange earnings were from fish until the 1960s. And when the fish stock had plummeted throughout the 1970s, this is when Iceland had started to transition to the electric economy it is today. For most of its history, Iceland was dependent on imported coal and domestic peat and dry dung for its energy uses. That changed in the early 1900s when the first hydropower station was made in a small town south of Reykjavik. It was a beastly 9 kilowatt machine used to power a single carpenter's shop. That's enough to power about 3 modern fridges. Many in Iceland figured they could follow a model laid out by the Norwegians at the time: build dams, provide electricity, and attract heavy industries like fertilizer or cement factories. The difference was, Norway allowed foreign companies to build these dams as long as they were given to the government after a certain amount of time, while Iceland completely banned foreign investment into them. As a result, these generators were small, built by individuals for individual use, usually for an individual farm. The state only got involved during the Great Depression, taking over from these tiny generators financed by individuals, and after some decades of chaos, created the publicly owned Landsvirkjun company to build new generators. Even when electricity prices were low and they weren't finding any foreign investors, the Landsvirkjun built to overcapacity, flooding the market with cheap electricity. Meanwhile, another innovation was taking shape that took even more pressure off of their electrical grid. Iceland sits between 2 tectonic plates. As the country literally gets ripped apart, magma rises to the surface, heating up many pools of water. Hot springs, geysers, and volcanoes cover the island. Many underground pockets hold water which reaches 250 degrees Celsius. Drilling a borehole down there could give you easy access to that water's energy. The first person to realize this was a farmer from the south. He built a pipe to transfer the heat from a nearby pool to his farmhouse, becoming the first geothermally heated home on the island. No longer would the citizens have to rely on imports or burning literal poo to stay warm. By the 60s and especially 70s, a concentrated effort was put in place by the Landsvirkjun to heat all homes using geothermal energy. And today, nearly all space heating is done via geothermal sources, as well as snow melting systems, heated pools, and indoor greenhouses. These are generally found to the south of Reykjavik, where a bounty of geysers and hot springs can be found. The large energy sources have meant Icelanders can increasingly grow year-round food including cucumbers, herbs, and tomatoes, which the country sources 75% of domestically. As part of research programs, horticulturalists have been able to grow cacao fruit, oranges, figs, ghost peppers, and yes, bananas. In the 1950s, there was even a 5-year-long trial to see if Iceland would be able to become a banana exporter, as Northern Europe had lacked a stable domestic supply of their most popular fruit. Yet even under glass, with all this heat and artificial lighting, the bananas had taken about 6 times as long to grow in Iceland as in Latin American or African countries. They simply couldn't compete with the insanely cheap banana prices that have grown into a leading symbol of globalization and intervention and corruption. Today, Icelanders import nearly all of their bananas from overseas, and banana farming in Iceland only lingers on as more of a hobby than a leading sector of its economy. The plentiful electricity supply didn't go to waste as their fruit industry never came to fruition. One of the explicit goals of creating the Landsvirkjun was to attract certain manufacturers to the island. Since Iceland is a closed loop, as in you can't exactly stuff electricity onto ships and send it off, the people who use the electricity had to go there. The magic material which Iceland actually got rich off of is aluminum. Smelting aluminum is incredibly electricity intensive, requiring 14,000 kilowatt hours per ton, far more than most metals. So the government saw an opportunity in attracting aluminum firms to the country. Import bauxite ore, use its cheap electricity to ship aluminum off, and keep the profit. The first to come was Aluswiss, which built an aluminum processing plant in 1969, attracted by low prices. Today, electricity costs somewhere between 7 and 13 US cents per kilowatt hour. Compare that to the US at an average of 17 cents, and running an aluminum plant is around 30% cheaper in Iceland, even with the higher wages and shipping costs, because electricity is by far the biggest input in turning bauxite ore into aluminum sheets. For Americans in the Rust Belt, these cheap Icelandic prices were a factor in losing their industry. From America's peak of 30 aluminum plants, they've fallen to only 4. In fact, 2 more plants were built in Iceland, both by American companies. Century Aluminum's in 1998 and Alcoa's in 2007. A 4th one was partially built but cancelled after their 3, basically only banks had collapsed in 2008. Now, Iceland makes roughly the same amount of aluminum as the entire United States does, or about 1/3 of Canada, or 1/30th of China. But look at the electricity generation graph throughout this time. Here's when they made those plants. Here's where the Fljótsdalur power station is, by far the largest in the country. Here's where the Alcoa plant is. Iceland's massive electricity supply is not going to its people. Only about 6% ends up in households, whereas over 70% goes to the 3 aluminum smelters. And if you still think 3 smelters doesn't sound impressive, consider that these alone generate about as much foreign exchange as their entire tourism industry, and going to Iceland isn't cheap. And yet, there's more to do with the electricity, as companies pour billions into big data, machine learning, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and big data analysis. They're going to need the computer power to do such Internet of Things. Companies like BMW already use Icelandic data to render their designs or run crash test simulations. Not only is it about 80% cheaper than running a British data center, but it solves much of the heat problem they face. To operate, these buildings must be kept at around 20 degrees Celsius, whereas the average summer temperature in Iceland is only about 10 to 12 degrees, meaning they can just use the outside air as a free source of AC. The extra heat could potentially be used to add more heat energy to the already well-built system. 3 companies already operate data centers across the country, totaling 200 megawatts in capacity, contributing to an estimated 7% of total electricity use and 5% of GDP. The hype for data gives the Landsvirkjun extra negotiating power against the aluminum companies, which critics say the country has grown too dependent on. Some other critics say they're too dependent on these new data centers, that Iceland's green energy shouldn't go to mining Bitcoin used for crime. The ex-Prime Minister has called for Iceland to grow corn, not data, with its electricity. But does that make sense? The history of trade routes starts out with small, precious things being traded among willing-to-pay elites. Things like silk, cinnamon, perfumes, and myrrh, whatever myrrh is. Then, with the European Age of Discovery and all this new land they had access to, trade became much more about outsourcing land, with popular items coming back to the old world being things like sugar, Brazil wood, and furs. It's relatively recent when we started trading bulky, cheap things, and small countries dependent on bulky, cheap things could join the global economy. Iceland isn't naturally rich in many things, but it is rich in electricity generating capacity. Since that can't be directly exported, the country has to export it virtually, either in metal form or literally virtually. As a byproduct, it's given the citizens some of the most clean energy and electricity on Earth, 2 things which dramatically improve the standards of living for whoever has access to them. Iceland's story is one of skilled management of trade, realizing its full potential by making the most of what they're best at. It didn't work for everything. Iceland never became Europe's banana plantation, but it didn't matter since they found the areas they were the best in the world at, and with that money, just imported the bananas and corn. And isn't that what trade is all about?